Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all here on a lovely day for a bit of a change for Canterbury, getting a bit of relief for the weather. My name's Ivan Lawrie. I work for FAR, which is the organization that looks after the research needs of the arable farmers of New Zealand. To my left, I have Simon Osborne, who's a very well-known grower from the Leeston region, and Dave O'Brien from Bellbird, who's also a local baker and supporter of New Zealand grown grains. So for those of you who are not that well acquainted with the New Zealand Grown Grains Initiative, it is something that's been brewing for about 5 years. FAR in representation of the growers, but also other parts of the industry recognize that the production of New Zealand grown grains was in grave danger of disappearing if we didn't do something about it. Many of you may not know, but especially in the North Island, most of the grain that supplies the bread, baking industries, and other food industries is actually grain that comes in from Australia. And for a series of circumstances and historic ones that I won't go into, the truth is it's very hard to get grain from the South Island, from our main growing areas, up into the North Island to supply where the larger population is. And so the challenge has been for us as a group to try and develop some consumer awareness not only from the end user, but from the bakers, from manufacturers, to understand where grain actually comes from in New Zealand, to also set some very clear targets around the tonnage that we need to maintain to keep this industry alive, which, as I say, is already under pressure for growing profitability in New Zealand, and growers are under pressure for a series of factors. But on top of that, we've got the very strong pressure from mills and other users bringing imported grain into the country. So we wanted to just tackle this from two angles. One of them, the main one, is probably that consumer awareness, to people to understand that the actual cost of grain in the end product is not very big, and that's been topical in the last few days with the news around the increases in price of bread. I can guarantee, and probably Simon here to my left will attest, that it's not because the price of grain has gone up at all. There are other factors at play. But often it's easy to think that if the price of the end product goes up, it must be the price of the growers are making money, or that's where the price increases come from. So over that 5-year period of discussing what the best angles of approach were and trying to use the carrot, if you like, for enticing people to join us, that was useful in some sense, especially we've had massive support from the smaller artisan bakers across New Zealand and other smaller industries, but trying to bring some of the bigger manufacturing companies along this road is more of a challenge. So we thought, with working closely with Angela from Eat New Zealand over this period, that actually launching a certification trademark that guarantees that the end product comes from a New Zealand grower would be a way to differentiate those products in the marketplace and to actually not only create consumer awareness, but in some way to encourage some of the bigger users of flour in the country to join this initiative. And so this is where we're at today. We have recently launched the trademark in Auckland in October last year. The license agreement is available to any users who want it. The license agreement is free of royalty. There's no cost attached to it. The users of New Zealand Grain that want to use this logo are free to do so, so long as they sign up to the license and commit to the traceability process that is in place, which will be audited. And that's to keep it fair, so that users like Dave can compete fairly against people who might say their grains are from New Zealand, but there's no way to actually guarantee that they are. So this process certifies that traceability back to the farm. So that's, in a nutshell, that's what we are trying to achieve with the New Zealand Grown Grains campaign. I'm sure there'll be a lot more to discuss of the panel, but I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to show their points of view and give their presentations.
Well, seeing as I'm holding the microphone, I might as well go next. Thanks, Ivan. So I'll just give you a grower perspective on where the grain industry is at the moment. So I'm farming at Leaston and regenerative cropping in as much as we can. So we've come from the conventional side. We're not organic. We're still reasonably conventional in some ways and almost organic in other ways. So yeah, it's sort of a hybrid system. But there's no greater pleasure than sitting in a combine harvester and there's a beautiful crop growing through the machine and the machine's making all the right noises and the bin's filling up really quick, and you know, it's just a great feeling. And growing the crop is an absolute pleasure. Grain crops are just, you know, they're just the greatest thing. You watch them as they transition through their growth stages, and you know, you nurture them and try and do the best job you can. I guess the depressing part for grain growers is is when you go to sell the grain. And it's not just the price, it's the people you have to deal with. So the milling industry in New Zealand, so this is for milling for human consumption, consists essentially of two companies. There's Champion Flour, who are owned by Nissin Milling in Japan. They're an old family business, old Japanese family business, but they have quite a good ethic, and they're trying to do, or a few years ago they decided they were going to do as much New Zealand grain in their goods as they can. And then on the other side you've got Wilmar, who essentially they're a huge multinational company based out of Singapore, and they don't give a rat's ass about anybody. They just want the cheapest grain for the cheapest price, and they use Western Milling and Farmers Mill in South Canterbury, and we'll have mills in the North Island that they do what they call toll milling. So they essentially just tell the millers what they're going to get paid to mill the wheat, and then they take it on, and they own Goodman Fielder bakeries. So for example, in Christchurch, the flour is milled in Christchurch, and then it's shipped in a bulk tanker to Nelson, where the bread's baked, and then that is put in a bread truck and sent back to Christchurch. So you've got an empty flour tanker coming down and an empty bread truck going north, and they screw everybody as hard as they possibly can. The local and artisan bakers are doing such a marvellous job. We want to support them, and they want to support us. And you know, I just want to. It's bloody hard work being a baker. So when we're all snoozing in bed, having a lovely time, relaxing, they're all working. So you know, you've got to recognise that. So just a few stats. Okay, clicker's not actually. Oh bugger. Yeah. So, so this is total production for both animal feed and for milling. We produce year in, year out, on average, about 400,000 tonnes of wheat, about 400,000 tonnes of barley, and about 200,000 tonnes of maize. What crosses the border coming in? Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million tonnes of palm kernel, 400 to 700,000 tonnes of wheat, 250 to 450,000 tonnes of GMO soy, and 250 to 400,000 tonnes of distillers' grains. So most of that, all of that, well, actually, the milling industry, Ivan will probably be able to tell me how many tonnes a year goes through the milling.
So Of the about 320 to 350,000 tons of milling wheat that go through the industry, 100,000 are New Zealand milling wheat, between mostly bread wheat and some biscuit wheat. But we're trying to raise that bar of 100,000 tons a year of domestic production, because when we started this initiative, we were sub 60,000, and that was putting, it was dangerously close to be below critical mass, so we couldn't keep the industry going. Just not to correct you, Simon, I don't want to set the record straight about Farmers Mill. That relationship with Wilmar is no longer. Farmers Mill belongs to Maori, which is a British-owned multinational, and the mill itself, based in Timaru, is 100% committed to New Zealand-grown grain and are signing up as licensees. So that's good news for us, that we'll have more than one mill processing exclusively New Zealand wheat.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Ivan. I'm pleased to hear that. I'm pleased that I'm ill-informed. So just a bit of a background into let's just talk about the grain that we grow for human consumption, and that includes obviously barley for beer and all the other things. So we have an ag grains quality certification system. So that's a total traceability system that farmers are audited about every 4 years, which means that we can trace any truckload of wheat that goes into the mill or the malting company can be traced back to a paddock, and that can be traced back to every input, the day that it was put on. So there's total traceability throughout the system, and I can pretty much assure you, if there's glyphosate residue coming through in your bread, it's not coming from New Zealand grain, because there has been a voluntary moratorium on using glyphosate pre-harvest, which is probably the only time that it's actually going to get into the crop, for more than 5 years. So, and farmers adhere to that pretty strictly. So we have total traceability. Anything that comes in a ship, they probably know which state it came from, and that's about the end of the traceability. So it's difficult for New Zealand cropping farmers to compete on price, because our land prices are high. We look after our staff and we pay them well, and we have expensive overheads because we're a long way from anywhere. So our cost structure is much higher than the likes of Australia, where they've got cheap land, broad acre, and they can do it very cheaply. But I would argue that the product is completely different. And talking to Champion Flour Mill in particular over the years, got to know the buyers and what have you quite well there, and they say, look, we just don't want it. One of the main reasons we want to go on this New Zealand grain kick is because it's so much better quality than what comes out of Australia. 25, 30 years ago, that was the other way around. New Zealand grain was pretty crappy and Australian grain was much better. But we've improved our varieties, improved our growing techniques, and producing some pretty nice bread and pretty nice bread wheats, and certainly even some of the bread wheats, I don't think anywhere else in the world, but they're used for pasta making here. So they're very strong, have very, very strong wheat. So yeah, we can produce probably the best quality grain in the world, I would argue, and that's partly due to our young soils, our high level of proficiency in growing the crop, our short supply chains, and our quality assurance programs. And New Zealand cropping farmers have to be enthusiasts, because why the hell would you get into it for the money? So that's pretty much me, I think. Over to you, Dave.
Thanks, Simon. I'm from Bellbird Bakery. We've got the red tent out the back there, and I see a couple of bags around, so thanks for your support there. I've been baking myself for 24 years now. A lot of early starts there, and I'm just saying that makes me quite tired. Yeah, I've baked at quite a few bakeries around the world, and with a real focus on sourdough and long fermentation breads. Also, sort of French pastries and things like that. With I guess the real focus that's always been a consistent in my time is using real ingredients. And no premixes or anything. I didn't get into baking to just throw a bag into a mixer and chuck a bit of water in, and the bag's got all the numbers and everything in there. I got into baking because I wanted, real bread with real ingredients, and these long fermentation processes were just had the most incredible flavours coming through. So. Bellbird itself has been going, it was set up with my friend Jeremy 15 years ago, just in his backyard. He had a little wood-fired oven out there, and would make loaves of bread and barter with his neighbours, with vegetables and things like that. And that he started, he got his own premises and started going to a local farmers market, where things kind of really started kicking off for him, and then he eventually got his, into a slightly bigger premises with someone else that was from the farmers market, and then the business just grew from there. I came on board about 8 years ago, and I think there was maybe at the time 3 or 4 people in the business. We're now up to 55 people in the business. We've got 3 shops around Christchurch, 2 farmers markets that's been a sort of a mainstay for us. It's really nice to have that connection to the farmers markets, but also to the farmers as well. And we do about I don't know the numbers of wholesale, but we do about 100,000 a month in sales to wholesale customers around Christchurch. So that's restaurants and cafes and Whole Foods stores and things like that. So we've got a really good following of people. We don't really have to, our product really sells itself. We've never really gone out there and actively sold it. People just come to us, and it's generally for the same reasons that we produce the bread for, and pastries for flavour and all those good things. Our business also is, as Ivan said, 100% supportive of local grains. All our flours come from Canterbury region. We're so lucky to have that immediate connection to local farmers. Just with most of the grain. There's a lot of grain is actually grown in Canterbury, and so we're really grateful to have those connections. So we have two flour sources. One is Farmers Mill, who these guys just spoke about in South Canterbury. The other one is Millmore Downs, who's just up the road here in Scargill in North Canterbury. So Millmore Downs is biodynamic organic flour, and that's actually a whole wheat flour. Not a lot of people know much about what a whole wheat flour is. It's the actual whole grain milled. So everything's in there. There's no byproducts. It's the whole grain. So that can be a bit full on for some people to actually eat, and they're not really used to that sort of stronger flavour. So we do blend that flour with the spray-free from Farmers Mill in South Canterbury. And really, I think the whole wheat flour, there's always seasonal fluctuations with wheat and flour. So we have to adapt as craftspeople to those seasonal, variables. And we've found that with the 100%, with the whole wheat flour, it is actually quite a tricky flour to work with. And that variability really shows up in the bread. One day it'll look great, next day it is as flat as pancakes. So it was a little bit too high risk for us, to be honest, to producing a bread, selling it to people, and standing behind it when you're looking at it, it's just a pancake. So that was a bit of a tough one for us. So we've made some adjustments there. In terms of a process, we have a 4-hour bulk fermentation, which is, and our ingredients are flour, water, salt. So there's no yeast. So we use a natural natural fermentation. It's called a levain, which is made the day before. So it's really a 3-day process. So we start the day before, we mix the dough the next day with the levain, and then 4-hour bulk fermentation, then an 18-hour proof in a cold environment, and then the next day we come in and bake it. So a lot of magic happens in that time. And the end product is amazing. I think we really stand behind the products in terms of flavour, but also trying to retain that nutritional value as well is a kind of cool part of what we do, using these whole ingredients. So we're trying to retain as much as possible. That's. I'm not sure what else to say on that, but. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. I mean, I make bread at home, and I take your point about things going flat sometimes. It's hard to get a rise out of it sometimes, but but it is a vastly different product to what you buy off the supermarket shelf. It's pretty much a different product altogether, a whole wheat flour. Just an idea that milling wheat, we are paid around about $520 a tonne. So in a half kilo of flour loaf, the farmer's return is about 25 cents. And I remember a miller, commercial miller, telling me once that flour is the second least expensive product that goes into bread. The cheapest being water because it's free. So I think the quality and of what we produce, and bread is such a wonderful nutritional product when it's made in the right way and made with the right ingredients.
And just to follow up on what Simon was saying about the components of the price of bread, and to bust a few myths that were around, we actually spent quite a bit of time over these 5 years to make sure that we had all the data to support this trademark coming into it. And there's probably 3 key pieces of work. One of them is around understanding consumer behavior and what the consumers actually understood about local bread. And for that, we launched a wide survey, 1,000 consumers at supermarkets, to understand what their views were on bread and what their understanding was around where the grain came from. Unsurprisingly, consumers understood very little about where the wheat came from. Most of them, I would say, assumed that because New Zealand is a farming country, everybody just felt, the wheat must come from New Zealand. Of course, it doesn't, and especially in the North Island. And so part of the interesting part of that survey was to understand what the price point would be that consumers would be willing to pay for a loaf of bread. And given what Simon was saying, which is just about right, somewhere between 25 and 30 cents a loaf is wheat. The rest is other costs that come into baking, which of course includes electricity and labor and a whole bunch of other stuff. But increasing the price of wheat, the local wheat, by 5%, 10% has very little bearing on the end point of a loaf, and that is something that we understood quite mathematically. Now, in saying that, the consumers at the supermarkets were mostly quite happy to accept that a standard loaf, a supermarket, not a premium product, a standard loaf at the supermarket would be quite happy to pay an extra 20 cents per loaf if they knew that the origin was New Zealand bread. Because at the end of the day, when you're filling your trolley, while the price of bread has increased significantly and for other factors, that is not the expensive purchase within your whole basket in the trolley. So one of the other things was between 20 and 50 cents was what the consumers were willing to pay. And that was more than half of the consumers that were surveyed. We did that before COVID, and we did that after COVID. Unsurprisingly, the figures of approval for local grain went up after COVID because people became more aware of the dangers of potential food insecurity, but also they'd had a chance over that period to read the labels on the products and understand where the products came from. So people took more of an interest in their food as they were stranded at home and cooking and preparing. So that was interesting to learn. So that's the consumer piece. The other bit we needed to really be certain about was to give people like Dave guarantees that the quality of the grain was there, because this myth about Australian grain being much better than New Zealand grain dates back to the mid-80s. And since then, New Zealand has invested over 35 years into plant breeding at a great expense, and the quality of the New Zealand premium milling wheats is beyond the quality of Australian wheat. We had some independent surveys with blind samples being sent to an independent testing, and the results were astounding that New Zealand wheat was not only better than Australian wheat for quality, but almost as good as Canadian wheat, which kind of is the standard bearer internationally. So we killed that myth. Yeah, and we don't, the only way that we can fight that myth is with good product and getting the message out there that these wonderful bread products, other products, are actually made from New Zealand wheat. So it's really important that getting that message out there and showing people that you can make good bread debunks that myth. The other piece that we needed, which is important and increasingly more important around consumer awareness, was the carbon footprint of our wheat versus the import. Again, no surprises there, but we needed to actually do the work, and again, hired independent consultants who specialize in carbon footprinting to compare what the footprint of Australian wheat landed in a New Zealand mill was compared to New Zealand supplied wheat from local farmers. And again, we were well below the carbon footprint of Australia, and that wasn't mostly due to the, people think that it's due to transport costs and fuel costs, but actually the main reason why we are more efficient in our carbon use in New Zealand is because our yields per hectare are much higher than the Australian ones. So for the same amount of input costs, chemicals, fertilizers, to an extent, we are more efficient in producing it, and that brings down the footprint per unit of the product. So having those three pieces, those key pieces of information in place, we felt confident that we could go public with this. So that's really what we've been focusing on now. As I say, there are many people in the value chain involved in this. Obviously the growers, we have a vested interest from the grower side, but we've had real support from the plant breeders, of course. We've got Plant and Food Research in the tent today here. They've invested many, many $1 million over the years in developing wheat varieties adapted to New Zealand and that provide the quality that the bakers need. To be fair, that's not a money-making venture for them. They keep it going on the New Zealand interest. The same with PGG Wrightson, who are the other plant breeders. They have kind of kept it going over time, but the volumes are not there to keep plant breeding alive in New Zealand unless we can double or hopefully triple the amount of milling wheat produced. Feed wheats is a similar situation, and we've had strong support from the feed mills in New Zealand. Again, as Simon showed in the slide, and you were actually conservative, last year New Zealand imported 2.7 million tons of PKE to the country. That is a lot of imported product from origins of, I would say, doubtful environmental credentials at the best. And that really is not, it's just a filler. It's not producing complete nutrition for animals. So we would like to see a lot of that replaced. And we're talking to people like Fonterra and Dairy NZ to try and get this across to them, that we really want more New Zealand arable products going into the dairy value chain, because it has strong environmental benefits as well. Reducing the nitrate leaching by compensating grass consumption with some carbohydrate is actually really good for the environment. So slowly we're making inroads and putting that idea across to our colleagues in the dairy industry as well. And of course, by doing that, they're supporting local growers, their neighbors, their local communities as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on just a comment you made early on there, Ivan, that describing artisan bread as being a premium product. I would argue that artisan bread is bread. Everything else is crap. So yeah, that's your bread and butter. It's not the other stuff's just rubbish. And I think that that's not just a flippant comment. When wheat goes into the flour mill, it is completely dismantled. Okay, it goes through the milling process. It's completely dismantled. They have a specification that they will have, and they'll reconstruct the flour. They'll recombine the components of the flour according to what their specification says. Often they'll add imported gluten to the flour to achieve the strength they want. This is from the miller's mouth. And because they've got no axe to grind here, but and some of the high value products like the oils and the germ is removed because it goes rancid quickly, and that's one of the challenges of using whole wheat flour, is it has a very limited shelf life. So it just is an extremely high quality product, but that should be the benchmark for human nutrition. I mean, if we want people to thrive and be able to think for themselves and all the other things, but I imagine politicians probably don't really want, but that's why the school lunch debacle is the way it is. It just shows how much we value our younger members of society, doesn't it?
Simon, how did the Roman soldiers keep their wheat good?
I have no idea, Roger, but I'm sure you're about to tell us.
Apparently they didn't grind it up. They carried the wheat in a wee bag, and between, I think, every 5 soldiers they had a wee grinder.
They must have had a name for that, did they?
Yeah, of course they did.
Yeah.
But that holds true today. So the reason why we move wheat around the world and not flour is precisely because what you're referring to. Wheat has a long shelf life, and if kept dry and ventilated, I won't say it's indefinite, but wheat can hold 2-3 harvests over harvests, and people can hold stocks of wheat from carry over from one year to another and still have a healthy product. The minute you turn that into flour, there's a shelf life. The other important thing is that within New Zealand, the mills also receive wheat. And I have asked the question of our millers in New Zealand why we don't move more flour around. There are pros and cons to that. Flour is quite dangerous to move in bulk. It can be a volatile, explosive product. But for us, because of the expense of the freight from the South Island to the North Island, it would make more sense to carry a processed or finished product rather than the bulk wheat in terms of cost of freight relative to the price of the product. But there is that difficulty that moving flour around is a lot more complicated than moving wheat around. So those aspects are the ones we need to work on. We're looking at examples like Tasmania has preferential freight rates across the strait onto the mainland. We would like to work with all parties in New Zealand to try and see if we could achieve something similar to get better conditions to move product from the south to the north, and also to develop milling wheat production and other grain production in the North Island, which is not impossible. It's just been moved aside because of the profitability of other primary activities, that's all.
Can you suited to gluten-free, enjoyed by consumers in an abundant sort of way.
You want to start from the baker's side of things?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to understand the question on that one.
Well, how can we make quality New Zealand product that hasn't been boosted with gluten more available to more people, so that gluten-free people are sort of more integrated into the food chain, and you're producing products that are profitable and productive and shelf life and edible and the whole picture, I guess.
So it's about gluten-free products?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we don't do any gluten-free products, just with risk of cross-contamination. So it's hard for us to produce. I mean, with anyone that comes in that's celiac, we just say we can't produce anything here. We have to basically have a whole nother separate bakery for that. So we don't sort of delve into any of that at all for the risk of that. We do say to people with gluten intolerances and things like that, we have some suggestions for them, and like sourdoughs is a really good option for that. I think I believe that's mostly due to processing of industrial breads and just how quickly the fermentation happens and getting in. There's no time basically between mixer and then it goes straight into tins and then into the oven as quickly as possible. So they're just trying to get it into the bag as quickly as possible, which has a really detrimental effect on our guts and things like that.
There might be good news on that front. It might be a few years away, but so purely from a wheat perspective, which is the main product used in baking, and the gluten is what makes bread. We have been working with Plant and Food Research over the past 3-4 years, sponsoring a PhD project, scanning the lines of wheat that are used in New Zealand. And one of the discoveries made is that there's the epitope, which is the component of the gluten that causes the allergy. Some lines of wheat have much lower ones than others. And so there's actually an active selection process to try and determine which lines of wheat are that low gluten epitope. And potentially, if we're successful in that, that might deliver some relief. I wouldn't say for the celiacs, because that's a dangerous message. Celiacs, that's a serious condition that we don't want to, as Dave says, you don't want to contaminate that. But that will probably develop varieties of wheat that will make the intolerant tolerant. Now, with respect to the cost of the product, we don't produce a lot of alternative grains in New Zealand that can be used. There is some buckwheat produced in New Zealand. I don't know if Simon has produced some. Those are low-yielding products. Hence, for the returns to the grower, they need to be of a higher value, and that is what makes a lot of these gluten-free products a lot more expensive. The ingredients just become more expensive to produce. Sorry, yeah.
Kia ora, Philippa Jamison. My question is really to you, Ivan, about the market research, consumer research that you did. Did you ask consumers about what they know about animal feed, stock feed, particularly for chickens? Because I think a lot of people don't know what commercial chickens are being fed, and there's this confusion also between free range and organic, and there's a lot of misinformation out there.
So I'll clarify that the surveys were purely around bread consumers at supermarkets. That was the focus of the surveys themselves. So no, to answer your question, we haven't gone out further. But again, I think so we do work closely with New Zealand. We have engaged with New Zealand Pork, for example, who, are very, again, like us, striving to survive and produce New Zealand grown pork in a way that can compete with the imports, which is really hard. We're working with them to also say, look, this could be hand in hand if New Zealand pork producers use New Zealand grains and give that visibility to the consumers. So that's something we're working on, and as I say, with the dairy industry as well. But no, we haven't surveyed anyone on food, on animal products.
Can I just jump in there for a sec? So that's, I don't think it's the grain component that worries us in animal feeds, it's the protein component, and it's all the soybeans that are coming across the border, 20% of which in the last year came from the US, and I think the majority of it is all GMO soybeans. So that goes into formulated feed for pigs, cows, sheep, chickens. So, you know, please make some noise about that, because we can grow. I think the thing is with soy, it's just such a high quality protein for animal feeds, and we can't produce. I mean, we can produce alternative proteins. New Zealand's not really suited to soybeans, but we can produce other legumes that will do a similar job. But we can't do it at the sort of money that. I mean, you know, one of the beauties about GMO is it kills farmers through killing the market. I mean, they're just so cheap. They're just a cheap commodity.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. You answered my question, which was where does the GMO soy go in this country? So most of it's fed directly.
Yeah.
Anyway, which is a real concern. But I did have one question for Dave. Dave, do you do anything about your water that you use in your bread? Do you do anything to the water that's coming into your process?
Good.
I guess you're using municipal treated water?
Yeah, we are. Yeah. As far as I know, I wasn't part of the setup of the new production site at the moment, but I don't think we have any sort of filtration system on the water. But yeah, would be good too.
Oh, you know, really you want 100 tonnes. So depending on where you are and how you grow, 10 to 20 hectares, I guess. But a 100-tonne line of wheat in New Zealand is still quite saleable, or even a 50-tonne line. But you know, your costs of testing and all the rest of it goes up. It's on a per line basis.
There's no restriction on what you can grow, and I think one of the nice things would be to fit in with a more regenerative perspective, would be to fit in production of grains in systems that are livestock based and start using that rotation to mop up nutrients and so forth. So that's something that we want to promote as much as possible. But as Simon says, there's a critical amount. You know, if you grew 2 hectares, it might not be profitable to do it, and you might not find any contractor to go and harvest it for you because it's too small. So there's a sort of, probably I'd say that 10 hectare paddock would probably be a minimum.
Yeah, if you wanted to do something like biodynamic or organic wheat, I think, you know, obviously the area that you'd need to grow to make a profit out of it would shrink, but your yield's probably a lot lower, possibly a lot lower, not necessarily be half anyway, but yeah.
I'll put my hand up. I come from the place that used to grow good wheat, apparently.
Quality's still the same out of Australia, just we've got better.
Yeah, great talk. I was interested in a few, well, I'm glad to hear that the mixed farming thing is alive and well here. Well, it sounds like at least that's what you're trying to encourage, because in Australia, agricultural systems have become much more simplified over my lifetime, especially sheep and wheat that's basically dead now. But I was interested in Victoria, where I'm from. There's been southern farming systems that developed about 25 years ago, 30 years ago,
We haven't certainly done any research on that. I know that the vegetable sector does, and particularly for potatoes and things like that, things have been using wider beds. You wouldn't think of it for the last few days here, but Canterbury is not particularly a region of the world that tends to be waterlogged. But we do, Simon's close to the lake, and we've been severely hit by weather in the last few days. Most of the soils that wheat is grown on, especially mid-Canterbury, a lot of it is quite free-draining soil. I think, but there are other techniques that are being evolved to improve, I think, just the efficiency and the resilience of the soils, minimizing tillage where possible. It's something that we're seeing increasing practice among farmers in New Zealand. Not as much as you would see in other parts of the world, but we'd like to see that grow. Simon, you might enlarge on that.
Yeah, on our waterlogged soils, it's usually dairy cows. On my system, I don't grow for maximum yield. I grow for maximum quality. So we're probably 30% off the pace with the maximum yield people, but we're probably also about 60% off the pace in terms of our input costs. So, and we're trying to reduce that impact. So you can choose to go either way, and I guess it just depends on the size of the mortgage as to, whether you sort of go for the... But I I think the attitude of a lot of growers I talk to is they sort of see that incentive to grow the maximum yield, but they actually want to grow maximum quality, and a lot of them are getting into biofermented fertilisers and that sort of thing to try and improve the nutritional uptake, plant health, soil health. Certainly a lot of reduced tillage. We don't do any and haven't done for 50 years now. So when we first started that, it was about a 95% reduction in fuel bills and tractor hours. So I've still got the tractor I bought 30 years ago. It's only got 4,000 hours on it, and that's the main tractor. So, makes a big difference.
So another innovation in Australia is what we generally call grassland grains. So what
Pasture cropping.
Pasture cropping, but also no-kill cropping. Has that had a foothold here at all?
Kind of challenging when you get a season like this, because and we've had several. So a friend of mine tried it. We did a trial together down in Southland, and he actually he grew a tall variety of. We had a tall variety of wheat that wasn't susceptible to sprout, very strong, and he did the graze the living daylights out of it in the autumn, and the no to try and. Oh well, yeah, he doesn't have irrigation, so just whatever moisture was there when he sowed, and it was actually quite successful. And he was able. It was tall enough that the heads just stood above the crop, so the yield was quite low, but the quality was very high, and he actually did quite well out of it. But his financiers said no. So there you go. Roger.
Simon, you briefly touched on this, but have you noticed in your time the nutrient density of the grains you're using now compared to when you first started farming?
I've never measured nutrient density, but I have discussed with the mill over time the quality of the protein of the wheat we're producing, and we actually got to the point where we would get preferential purchase because of the quality of the protein that was coming from our wheat, and it's a lower nitrogen, quite a low. We have quite a low nitrogen input fertilizer-wise. Most growers would sort of shiver at the amount of nitrogen that we use because it's so little, and that's why our yields are lower. But also the quality is higher, and it would be interesting to see some research work that looks at the quality of the protein, the susceptibility of gluten intolerance, in relation to all those things, but I'm not aware of any of that work having been done here.
So it's actually underway. Been going on now since last season. So this current season will be the one, and that's funded by the New Zealand Baking Association, the Flour Millers, and FAR. And it's a project that's looking precisely at that, how agronomy and inputs affect quality of protein and quantity of protein. Because that was work that hasn't been done on newer varieties. So that's currently underway, and that's a 2-year or 3-year funded project.
Yeah, I mean, it's like animals. The less soluble fertilizer you use, the less health problems you have. And the less fertilizer we use, the less weeds we grow, so that leads to, less chemical inputs and those sorts of things. But yeah, like we've even done trials with grazing wheat and been able to eliminate the use of in-crop herbicides because we just don't have that weed pressure at harvest time. And the sheep do extremely well on it, but you need a hell of a lot of them. Like for 100 hectares of wheat, we'd need 10,000 sheep for a month, and we just can't do that. So we might graze one crop here or there, but we just can't manage it the rest of the time.
Part of the reason I asked that question is my brother used to grow grain in Kaikoura, and his grain would get tested by the pig farmers who would buy it. But when it went for human consumption, they weren't at all worried about the quality of the grain. I think that's changed now, but it just shows you pig farmers were smart back in the day.
I would say that all grain going for human consumption in New Zealand is thoroughly tested and analyzed for a whole lot of parameters. So, yeah, and as Simon says, one of the things that all contracts for human consumption in New Zealand include is that no glyphosate is applied, no desiccants are applied. That's in the contract, and I get this question a lot about glyphosate. I just want to assure people that the grain that is for human consumption in New Zealand does not have that, and to a large extent, the feed mills are looking at putting some clauses in contracts as well. I think it's a practice that is disappearing. It's slowly disappearing. It was used out of necessity because we have such wet harvest conditions here that it was a way of getting the harvest off the ground, but hopefully we're going to see less and less of that.
Ivan, do you have any New Zealand grown buckwheat? New Zealand grown buckwheat available?
Yes, there is. Smallish quantities. I know of 2 companies in mid-Canterbury that grow and do contracts for growers with buckwheat. I think you were talking about Champion. Champion had buckwheat contracts as well at one point, or were involved in that, sourcing it.
I don't know whether Champion did, but I grow buckwheat,
Yep.
but not for them. Yeah.
So earlier on in the chat, you were talking about market awareness, consumer awareness being quite a key pillar. What is resonating? What messages are cutting through, and where are you finding success with that communication piece?
Angela's our expert on the matter. So we work closely with Eat New Zealand, and actually they've done a fantastic job in linking us into the wider consumer community and the baking community. I would say just the first part of that is we're mainly driven by a farmer organization, so we're not experts in marketing and communication, so we have to bring other parties to the fray. Doing that on a shoestring is really hard because we haven't got multi-mega bucks to spend on that, so we're going to try and do it as wisely as possible. I think using media, using social media, using several channels, we're just setting up our website now, will go a long way to do that. But Angela, please expand.
Yeah, I think we're not a beef and lamb. We're not a dairy NZ. So using those same techniques is really difficult because you just don't get cut through. And cut through has changed anyway, as I'm sure I don't need to let you know. Our attention is really disparate and dissolved now. So from our perspective, we think it's about influencing the influencers and finding the early adopters and people who understand the value of the story that we're telling, and creating a movement. So this change is movement building. It's creating awareness around an ingredient that most of us never think about, unless we're gluten-free or celiac, you know. It's something that people don't consider where it comes from, yet they might think about where the vegetables, the fruit, the milk and the meat on the plate comes from, and people don't connect it back to our actual farmers. So I think it's slow, deep, hard work without a lot of budget. But I have to say one thing, and that is that arable farmers are my favourite farmers. They're never driven by only the dollar. They're always driven by the kaupapa and why they do it. And I really fear that we're going to lose them. So I really think that it's important we keep this conversation going.
Can't end any better than that.
Well, thank you, everyone, and we're, at your disposal to answer any questions you might have about New Zealand grown grains, the campaign, how to get a license. The website and the QR code is there for anybody who wants to contact us. Thank you very much.